Hello and welcome to the fifth video in this series, learning HTML, JavaScript and CSS by making a Space Invaders application. So I'll switch to the browser here from where we left off in the last video then, with our slightly off-centered sprite on the screen, our spaceship. In this video what we're going to do is we're going to solve that off-centering, and we're actually going to put the sprite on the screen from the code rather than hard coding things in by the CSS. You remember in the last video we added in a div somewhere down here with the sprite in a sprite class, and then in styles.css we added the sprite details, where we detail the background image we want for our sprite, the width, the height, etc., and the z index, position and everything to get our sprite hard coded onto the screen. Now obviously it's not very flexible, it's fixed as it is, and I'd rather put the sprite on the screen from code. So the first thing I'm going to do then is I'm going to make some changes to the styling from the sprite itself and the sprite class itself. So the only thing we'll actually need is the z index and the position. We won't need the rest of this, so I'll get rid of that. Now if I refresh the screen I'll have nothing on there because I'm specifying a sprite div with absolutely nothing inside. The other thing I want to do in index.html then is just get rid of our sprite div completely, and we'll create it then from the code. Now just before we start, you'll remember in the early videos, particularly if you're just starting, we started dealing with objects. So here I have an object variable with let called game manager with some keys and some values. Now we're going to create our sprites in a similar way, except we're not going to use objects like they are written here. We're going to use something called classes. Now essentially behind the scenes, classes in JavaScript are converted into objects. And we're going to use classes not because I want to use a slightly different syntax, but because they come with a certain advantage, and that certain advantage is something called inheritance. Now often when you start learning programming and you hear about inheritance, things get scary very quickly, but it's actually a really simple concept. And the point is that I'm going to have, apart from my player, other types of sprite on the screen, but they're going to have slightly different properties. So for example, I'm going to have the enemy. Now the enemy is not going to move when I press the keys or anything like that. It's going to do slightly different things and have, like I said, slightly different properties than our player. But they're going to have a lot of things in common. So they're going to be based on an image with a certain size. They're going to be placed on the screen in a certain way. And they're going to do quite similar stuff. So what I'm going to end up doing is creating a sprite class, which you can also see as an object. But I can then inherit all of the properties of that class, all of the keys of that class, when I then create, say, a player class that inherits from the sprite class, and we'll see that later on. However, in this video, we'll just create the sprite class. What we need to do before that, though, is a little bit of preparation. We're actually going to need to create 3 new files in our JavaScript here, so let's go ahead and do that. One will be size.js, one called point.js, and one called sprite.js. And the first thing I'm going to deal with is size. So we're going to end up specifying for sprites and other things in the game a size. And a size is essentially a class, or if you like, an object that has a width and a height. So to declare a class in JavaScript, it's very easy. I type class, the name of the class, some squiggly brackets. And then I need to put inside here what's called a constructor. And a constructor can have parameters, and it's something that's called when I create an instance of size. So when I create a size object, the constructor will be called, and I can use that to initialize some variables and things, and I can also pass some parameters. So we're going to make a constructor where we pass a width and a height, and then we'll create some properties of this class called width and height. So now we have a size object available where we have a width and a height. What I'd just very quickly like to do now, just brutally in this file here, is create one and then print it to the console so you can have a look what's going on. So I'm going to say let s equal new and size. Then I can give it a width of 19, a height of 30, and then log it to the console, and we can have a quick look at the browser what's going on. Of course, the first thing we need to do is include our 3 new files. So I'm going to go into index.html. and add in our new files, and then to the browser and refresh. And now you can see in the console here we've got S, we've created a size object or class, and as I told you it gets actually converted into an object behind the scenes, and we have a key width and a key height, and the squiggly brackets here denote it's an object, so height 30 and width 19. So hopefully that gives you an idea simply of how classes work, very, very similar to objects, but the key thing is we get this constructor here, which is really nice, and we also get then the ability, I could inherit from size with something else and have the width and the height properties already available. It just makes things a lot easier with typing and structuring the code and understanding what's going on. So we'll move to our point class then, and in terms of our point class, set this up very similar to size. So we're going to have a constructor, and for our point we're going to have an X and a Y, but we're going to add a couple more functions. One is an update function, so we can update the X and the Y. And then I'm also going to add an increment function where we actually increment the value rather than by a certain amount rather than setting it in update. It's a slight but subtle difference. So here I have increment, I take in an X and a Y, and I increment then the X and the Y of my point by the specified amount in the arguments. So we've got two classes written already, and it's fairly clear how they're done. Trickier will be the sprite class that we're going to write. So let's write our definition. And now the first thing we need to write for our sprite obviously is a constructor. And in the constructor we're going to take a number of parameters. We're going to take the name of the div, so the div that our sprite is existing in, that'll be its ID. It'll need a position, which will be a point. It'll need the name of its image, because we'll be needing that when we specify the image in the div. And we'll also need the size of our sprite, and that will be used so that we can shift the sprite the sort of half its own size I explained in I think the last video, so that the positioning point of the sprite is in the center of the sprite and not the top left corner. So I'm going to add in those four parameters when we create a sprite: the div name, the position, the image name and the size. What's remaining to do then is specify those four as properties of this class. So I have a position, I have a name, I have an image name and I have a size. I want to do one more thing. I want add something called an anchor shift. And this is going to be a point. And this is going to be the size of the sprite, width and height, divided by 2, multiplied by -1. And again, just as a quick recap as to why we're doing this, here I've got the sprite on the screen, and when it's positioned where the red dot is. So the X and Y coordinates will be given as that. And we want the red dot to be in the middle. So if we shift our sprite by X minus its width over 2 and Y minus the height over 2, then we can position effectively the sprite in the middle of the point that we're specifying. The way we do this then is we'll use this anchor shift, which is the width and the height respectively divided by 2 multiplied by -1. So when we add these anchor shift X and Y onto the position of our sprite and redo the position, it will effectively be shifted so the position that's specified is in the middle of the sprite. So let's just do some of those position functions now, and then we'll start writing the functions to add the sprite onto the board. So the first one we're going to write is called setPosition, and there I'm going to send in an argument for the X, an argument for the Y, and also an argument as whether I want to shift the sprite according to its anchor position or not, because in some cases I might not want to. So my position is a point, I'm setting the position, so I'll update the current position according to the X and Y that come in. And now I'm going to say that if shift equals true, this dot increment our position by the anchor shift X, and the anchor shift Y. I have to give a quick disclaimer here. I might make some bugs or some errors in the typing here that I only see when I actually go to run the program, but we're going to do that right at the end. So hopefully I'll get everything right. The next thing I need, this is to set a position and say whether we want to shift the position that we're setting by the anchor shift. The other thing I want to be able to do is update the position, and this is very similar to the syntax for setting the position. But here I'm just updating the position with the specific X and Y fixed. And last but not least, I'm also going to want to increment the position. So I'm just going to copy the update position function here. Increment the position, and I'll call this, I'll call these arguments IX and IY just so we don't get completely confused. So as a quick recap then, we take in the div name, the position, the image name and the size. We set some properties of our class here, and then we set this anchor shift so we know what to shift in the X and Y directions to get X and Y coordinates to be in the middle of our sprite. Then we've got three functions. That one sets the position, where we say whether we do want to shift the sprite according to what's been set. We update our position, which is just done according to an X and a Y, and we increment our position as well. So if I say I want to move +4 in the X and +1 in the Y, I would use this increment position. If I wanted to update the position adding 4 or Y, I could do this position.update with this position.x plus the X, etc, etc. So I've got lots of flexibility to move the position of my sprite around, and crucially including the incrementation of the position here. However, what I'm missing from this is I'm missing the ability to actually draw my sprite and add it to the board. So here we're going to add three new functions in. One of them is to actually remove the sprite from the board. So this is the simplest of the new functions. And here we'll use jQuery selector to select our div with the hash for the ID. So we select the div name for this particular sprite with the hash because we're selecting an ID, and then we just tell jQuery please remove this particular div from the web page. And then I'm going to have a draw function where I draw my sprite onto the screen, and this is very similar to the remove from board. So I'm going to select my sprite div, and then I'm going to update the CSS of this div, and I'm going to update the top and the left. So I'll update those with an object, and there I will set the left and the top to the position X and position Y of my sprite. So I'm simply updating the CSS, which will have the effect every time I call draw of moving the sprite around. That means, however, that after each of the position setting functions down here, I need to call the draw function. And one thing I haven't said, and if you're new to this might have been quite confusing, is the this. So the this refers to the current object on which we're operating here. So if I've got a sprite object, say player, and I call player.draw, then it will use its own, if I use this div name, this.position, this.position here, position.y, its own specific values. So in set position here, I'm saying please call the draw function of this object. I might have a draw function drawn somewhere else, defined somewhere else. JavaScript needs to know which draw function I want to use. I'm saying please use the one that comes as the part of the object that this class represents. So now every time I set my position, update it or increment it, I'll then call draw, which will update the CSS, so i.e. the left and the top, of my div that contains my sprite, and then I'll see my sprite move effectively on the board. The last thing I need to do then is the most complicated function, that's actually add it to the board at the beginning. So a new function, this time with an option to say when we add it to the board if we already want to shift its position. Now I'm going to use some pure JavaScript, not jQuery. There's lots of ways of doing this. I like to do it this way. I'm going to create a new div element here. I'm going to add a sprite class to my div element, and I'm going to give my div an ID, so a unique ID, the div name that was given as a constructor as part of the constructor to this sprite class. I'm then going to set the background image on the style, and I'm also going to set the height and the width in pixels, just as we did in the CSS file, but now in the JavaScript here. So I'm going to set it to this.size.width and this.size.height. The size, remember, was passed in the constructor. And now the only thing we need to do is actually use jQuery to select our div and append the new div that we've created to the play area. Just go to index.html. So this is our play area div here. We'll be appending, after this one that already exists, we'll be appending then the new sprite div that we've created. And the last thing to do then is set the position and say whether we want to shift. So we'll call this .setPosition. And that will then position our sprite on the board according to whether we want to shift or not. So that's a lot of code in there. Hopefully it's relatively simple to understand. We've not really done anything different to what we've done before. It's just we've got classes and we've got an object now called a sprite, and we can create one of these, specify its div name. In the case of the player, that was in defs, so player sprite here. And then we can let the we can specify its div name, so its position, its image name, so we get the correct image specified here when we set the background image, and we have its size coming in as well, so we can set the size properties. Everything that we hard coded in styles.css before is now set in the code, and then we can append it to the play area div. And now we can make lots of sprites and send in different sizes, positions, image names, and they'll all be added to the play area according to the parameters that we send. And you can see how it's much more flexible than doing this in pure CSS. Last thing we do then is set the position, which calls the setPosition function, and then we increment according to whether we said we wanted to shift according to the anchor, and then we draw setting the left and the top properties. And all being good, we should end up seeing our sprite on the screen. So the only thing remaining to do is to actually create the sprite itself. To do that, we're going to make a function called resetPlayer. And in this function, we're going to write the code to actually create our player. Remember, when we first start up, our game manager has a player, but it's undefined. So the first thing to say is check whether it is indeed still undefined. Now, in our case, it always will be when we first start up the application, but later on, when we finish a game and restart, then we won't create a new player. If you've already got one, we'll just reset the player, but that's some functionality that's coming later on. For now, we'll just make a new one. So first of all, we need our asset so we can get the size. And now we have our asset, we can make the player. So there we have our rather long-winded with the text zoomed out so much constructor. But what we have then is our new sprite with the div name, the position we want to set it, which is the player start X and the player start Y, which I quickly flicked back to look at while I was writing it here, which we already had defined in our game settings. The file name, which of course is in our asset, and then the size from our asset object. You'll remember, if I just go back to the browser, that we had the asset here. So we have in our asset the file name here, so where to get the file, and then the width and the height are in here. So we use those then to set the size, the width and the height, and get the file name of the file that we need to draw our sprite. So that's all we need to do to reset the player. What we could do is actually log this to the console. So when we've finished all that, we can log our player to the console and see exactly what's going on. So the last thing to do there then is, in the init here, we'll call reset player and hope that everything's working. And of course I quickly flicked and realized that I've forgotten to add one key thing here, and that's for the player itself. I need to call the add to board function that we wrote here, otherwise I won't actually be adding the player to the board. And I actually want to remember shift it as well, so I'm going to put true because I'm going to shift it so that its positioning point here ends up in the center of the sprite. So I'll try that again. And now you can see we've got the sprite on the screen, and it's nicely centered with the screen rather than offset because we've shifted the sprite. If I have a quick look in the console here, you can see now we have our sprite object, That's what our player is. And we have an anchor shift, which says how much to shift X and Y if we want to shift the point specified to the center, the name of the div, the image name that was used, the current position, which is now shifted, it's different to this position that we specified, and the size. And if we go into elements, you'll see that we now have a sprite added in there from our code with the styling that we specified in the add to board. So very nice. We've been able then to add our sprite onto our game. That's one of the most involved videos probably we'll do in the series, but if you can get your head around the concept of classes and objects and functions, then you've learned the most difficult and major part of everything. It's pretty much plain sailing from here on in. So good. It was a bit of a longer video than I wanted, but it's good to get that far and get the sprite done. Onwards and upwards. Thank you very much for watching. Leave a comment, question, anything like that, and see you in the next one.